Hello everybody. Oh great, I didn't have to do the lights again. Okay, well, welcome to Wednesday. Another exciting day ahead of us, I'm happy to say. So we're going to start straight off. Excuse me. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you today Alison Jones and to Kawehau Hoskins from the University of Auckland. I'll take them separately, obviously. I mean, Alison is now a long-standing friend and colleague, and you'll probably be familiar with her work already because Alison's been, in her work previously, again, a hugely staunch but fierce critic of feminist post-structuralist research in education. And I was going to say several generations, but I better not say that. A lot of women scholars are indebted to the space that Alison opened up and kept critically open for the doing of feminist post-structuralist research. And she's the author and co-author of several books. She's worked on Sylvia Ashton Warner with Sue Middleton, and wrote a wonderful book on touchy subjects on the issue of touch around young children, which is perennially relevant, actually. And many others. She's got a recent book, and we'll probably be having a little look at that today later on new materialist encounters around Maori education and culture. And that's where Alison has been doing a lot of her work recently, and you'll be hearing about that today. Absolutely fascinating work around encounters with Maori culture and education. And her co-presenter today is Kawehau Hoskins, who is again a member of the School of Maori Education with Alison at the University of Auckland. And she's been working on ethical governance, bringing Maori and Indigenous thought together with Levinas's theoretical insights. Now, I'm not sure if she's going to actually touch on that today, but I'm just going to hand over now to Alison and to Kawehau, and we'll get going. Thank you for that.
Oh, tēnā tātou katoa. He tū poto tēnei te mihi ake kia tātou katoa e hui mai nei tēnei rangi a tāhua, ki tēnei whenua, ki ngā tūpuna o tēnei whenua, o tira kia tātou katoa i tēnei rā kānui rā te mihi kia koutou, o tira kia koe hoki Maggie nau te karanga kia hara mai māua, nō reira kānui hoki te mihi kia koe. Just a short mihi in the language of my ancestors. My name's Kawehau Hoskins. I live in Auckland, at Auckland University, but were born and raised in the north of New Zealand, a little place called Whangarei, and that's my tribal area, which is Ngāpuhi. And Alison is going to be talking about some of my ancestors today. So we just wanted to start by briefly introducing ourselves, because we know we come from far away, and perhaps our context is not that familiar to some of you. So we want to just briefly contextualise the work we do as researchers and teachers. We work together in Te Puna Wānanga, which is a School of Māori Education within the Faculty of Education at Auckland University in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And some of you might be familiar with the work of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith in decolonising methodologies and Indigenous methodologies in education, and Linda's a colleague of ours and a friend, so that maybe is something by way of context. The field of Māori education and its larger territory, Indigenous education, as many of you may know, is a politically charged site of research and practice. The politics work in at least two directions. On the one hand, there are the interminable colonial assumptions and practices against which Māori initiatives, including our own work, have to struggle. On the other hand, there are powerful Māori identity politics at work, which render collaborations such as ours between Māori and Pākehā, this is the word in New Zealand for white person. So these identity politics render collaborations such as ours between Māori and Pākehā scholars as risky. Both of us are interested in theoretical frameworks that provide a methodology that offers an alternative to both the essentialism that tends to predominate in Māori education at the moment, I argue, and to destabilise dominant European ontological and epistemological assumptions at play in much New Zealand educational research. Over to you, Buddy.
So, with this background in mind, our presentation today, which we're hoping will be shorter than 60 minutes, so we have some opportunity to have a conversation with you, it's a tentative exercise in returning to the object, to the real things that have been understood by many social scientists following the linguistic turn as accessible only as the products of culture. Our work has been provoked by our encounters with the new materialism of particularly Jane Bennett and its collision or its engagement with our political project. Now, the term new materialism, and as you know, sometimes called new empiricism, is an emerging phrase in education, and its use has a number of quite different strands already. For us, so far, it is Bennett's work in her 2010 book, Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things, and Karen Barard's book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, and also Vicky Kirby's work on the material that have been most provocative. What seems to be new about their arguments, it seems to us, for our work anyway, is the recognition of the agency of the object, their focus on the object nature side, if you like, of the binary subject object nature culture, although they're not attempting to just simply reassert those binaries and focus on one side, but to turn, if you like, to that, what they see as a kind of neglected force in that binary relationship. Central to Bennett and Barard's work is the idea that rather than being the passive products of language, as they are rendered in social constructivism's obsession with discourse, objects, including bodies, have agency. They have effects and make demands. They have thing power. In Vibrant Matter, Jane Bennett takes the idea of thing power into the social sciences, and it's her work that has stimulated our curiosity about what it might mean to take the power of things seriously in our own work. Now, we're going to begin our talk today with a recording made this year in New Zealand of the arrival back in New Zealand of 3 soldiers who'd been killed in Afghanistan. They were 2 Māori men and a Pākehā woman soldier. The plane carrying the coffins has just arrived. The coffins have been loaded into a hearse. And here in this video clip, a contingent of soldiers greet the bodies in an affective performance of immense power and physicality. I think one of the things that's important to realise when you watch this clip from the outside, if you're not familiar with everyday culture or everyday life in New Zealand, that this is an unchoreographed event. It would have been expected, but not choreographed. And it's certainly not an unusual event. And the clip it takes 3 minutes. So we'll play that. Let's hope that it all does its thing.
Let's just have the lights off because it's a bit blurry and it might help you.
Where do we play the whole video?
Up there.
Actually, that's very powerful in itself, but if you're actually amongst that, the noise, we couldn't get the volume loud enough here, but the noise is completely deafening, so it's a very engaging place.
So there's a lot going there, and if you can set aside the kind of context of the army and, you know, huge sort of masculinity and etc., we, among other things, were struck by the effect and affect that these dead bodies, usually thought of as lifeless and inert matter, produce in and from this group of living people. The bodies are anything but inert. They are actants, or working as affective catalysts, in Jane Bennett's words, capable of activity and responsiveness, of producing effects in other living human bodies. We are thinking about affect here as a form of materiality, as entering into composition with the affects of other bodies, exchanging actions and passions, the colliding of particle forces. So dead bodies in Māori practice are spoken to, they're addressed, they can hear, and the breath, the tears, the mucus of mourners enters into composition with them. There's really no absolute duality between dead and alive. Rather, the Māori, I think it's up there, or matter energy of bodies is merely in a state of change. Living matter is what we would call Māori order. The dead are Māori mate. They living things and dead things have Māori, albeit in different forms, in different configurations. As Alison said, our talk today is an exercise in interrogating our work in the fields of Indigenous studies, following our encounters with the new materialism of Jane Bennett, Karen Barad and others with whom many of you are now familiar. There are many, many ways in which elements of the new materialism might be put to work, but we have been curious about how the latest fascination with the material might forward our attempts to think and rethink the ongoing questions and complex practices that shape Māori studies and education. I've got that slide.
There it is.
So I'm just going to talk now a little bit about the context of my work. Kaupapa Māori, a few of you might be familiar with, names a theoretical and methodological movement developed by Māori scholars in the context of Indigenous theorisation over the past 20 or 30 years. And Linda Smith's work has been part of that movement. Kaupapa Māori appears routinely in the work of researchers in the field of Māori and Indigenous education, and has become influential in a wide range of social and policy practice sites, from health to architecture. That's been a really interesting kind of development in the context of New Zealand, because it's opened theoretical and political space, but it's also been taken up in social policy and state practice as a kind of a broad set of ideas to do with Māori ways of doing things, Māori politics, cultural logics and so on. So kaupapa Māori is both a politics on one hand and the promise of theorising from Indigenous Māori philosophies and approaches and practices on the other. So there's these two kind of dimensions of kaupapa Māori. As a politics, it's been particularly successful in making space in the academy and across a range of sites for Indigenous Māori cultural logics and practices. The underpinnings of kaupapa Māori politics have drawn mainly from elements in critical theory, taking up an anti-colonial position and an agenda of social transformation. Much of the political theorisation of kaupapa Māori has sort of sat in that frame and continues to sit there, even though we're sort of 20 years on. And part of my interest has been to kind of to think differently about the political underpinnings of kaupapa Māori. particularly given that kaupapa Māori, on the other hand, is interested in theorising from an Indigenous kind of base, which to me opens a whole range of different ways of thinking about politics, thinking about relationships and so on. So I've argued elsewhere that the desire to develop theory drawing from Indigenous thought with its orientation to relationship and non-dualism is at times at odds with the politics of kaupapa Māori. Kaupapa Māori often rests on the assertion of strategic, sometimes forgetting that they're strategic, essentialisms, inverting binary positions and creating counter-identities, all in a sense necessary in a certain context. Indigenous theory can mount decolonising critiques, but in doing so remains, I'm arguing today, at best deconstructive. In response, I've sought to work with Māori sources in ways that orient political theorisation towards relationality and therefore responsibility for others, whoever they might be. My interest in beginning to explore new materialist theory is to think through the ways it might open, engage, extend and question Indigenous Māori thought, much of which has survived in a fragmented state post-colonisation. And in returning to Māori philosophical concepts, I attempt to enact some of the creative potential of kaupapa Māori. I also seek possibilities for these new materialisms to engage with Indigenous and Māori thought, so not a one-way street. After all, according to Harman and Latour, new materialisms claim to seek traces of a new metaphysical sound from any nation in the world. Indeed, if the intellectual traditions of Indigenous peoples remain overlooked, does this not simply reaffirm the nature-culture binary new materialisms seeks to dismantle? Through such engagement, we may or may not find possibilities for the emergence of new agencies through Indigenous new materialist intra-relations. In Indigenous and Māori traditions, the liveliness of matter is grasped as quite ordinary. Indigenous Māori onto-epistemology is what I would describe today as a kind of immanent relationality. Māori think about and describe the universe or pluriverse as a vast whakapapa or genealogical web, a dynamic, interacting kinship where humans, non-humans and all things are always already inside or as relationships. We come into being through relationships. We, that is all matter, literally gives rise to or we generate one another through ceaseless processes of self-organisation and becoming. Barad and Haraway have argued that beings do not pre-exist, they're relating, and while that's a really complex idea, I'm understanding, it is an idea that resonates with aspects of Māori thought where new configurations of the world are born through generative couplings of other configurations in a kind of ongoing process, if you like, of becoming. So these sorts of ideas are, not particularly new in a certain way to Indigenous thought. I was talking to a tribal leader and an activist, a person I know, the other day, who was complaining to me about a set of laws that are preventing her people from living communally on their land. And these are laws that express the idea that the best thing for nature sometimes is for humans to leave it alone, that kind of separation, because humans are bad for nature. And my friend exclaimed, "They don't understand, we are nature." And that, that's kind of a common sense thing to say in a certain way, but it's a kind of thing that's said often, every day. So it's common to talk about a river, a tree, a mountain, an entire tribe or an ancestor that lived hundreds of years ago as yourself. I am the river and the river is me. It remains common for objects to be thought of as alive, as relatives, ancestors, as determining events, exerting forces, as being intelligible, as changing and instructing people, as expressing itself and speaking to us, and our being able to hear. In other words, doing all the things we might attribute to culture. Nature is culture and vice versa. A waka, or a large canoe, has its own name and personality. It is an ancestor with a real kin relationship to the tribal people from whose forest it was made. Genealogically, trees are older siblings to people. Such Indigenous thought has routinely been dismissed by Western thinkers as merely superstition, animism, or anthropomorphism. Bennett suggests that anthropomorphizing is a useful methodological practice. It works against, actually, anthropocentrism, she asserts, because a chord is struck between human and thing, and it reminds or notices that human agency has echoes in non-human nature. Anthropocentrism, however, usually attributes human characteristics to non-humans, while Indigenous thought typically does the opposite. It attributes non-human characteristics to humans. Māori language is replete with examples of humans as non-humans. Someone stubborn is understood as having the tenacity of a hammerhead shark, or someone in the midst of a bait is encouraged to be as firm as Te Toka Tū Moana, the boulder standing in the sea, not like Te Toka Ruringa Tai, Nekinga I Te Ngaru, the rock rolling in the tide shifted by the wave. In Māori thought, all beings and things have particular qualities and capabilities by virtue of their becoming in the world. This is not the particularity, I'm arguing, of pre-existing independent objects, but qualities that come into the world excuse me, through and as relations. Māori thinking shows significant regard for these unique expressions of the world, and it remains commonplace for us to speak about and practice such understandings. For example, karakia up here, sort of assertions to the universe, or evocations if you like, are performed in everyday settings to both evoke material forces and always, I think, to attempt to bind or fix or entangle those forces in productive relationships with people who are part of the world as well. Karakia can be thought of, perhaps, as participating in a kind of material discursive unfolding of the world. For example, karakia might be spoken at the beginning of a meeting, or in a range of settings, but that's a common one today, to bring the energetic forces, bodies, spaces, ancestors, the earth and the sky into productive engagement for that time. This Indigenous understanding about being of the world, of course, has no Cartesian roots and has developed from a different starting point than the one that has subjects and objects, knowers and known, minds and matter. It cannot even really imagine an absolute dichotomy between things and science, nature and culture. The non-differentiation of nature and culture suggests Indigenous nature cultures might have something to contribute to discussions about Western dualist onto-epistemologies, or intra-relating with the vital materialities of the world in ways that might see more, for example, ecological modes of production and consumption. Take the example of everyday encounters between people and between people and buildings, mountains, rivers and all kinds of objects. The greeting is kia ora, you might have heard it, kia ora, literally be alive, be well, or tēnā koe, there you are. This is not a greeting to an individual per se, but a kind of a reiteration of the commonality of our shared vitality or being in the world. So I'm just going to finish my section with just these couple of images, which is the hongi, and you might have seen this image. It's kind of probably not this particular image, but this act. And so there are two images here. The top one is the image of people engaged in greeting each other in a more traditional setting on the marae, in a cultural setting of Māori gathering places, the marae. And then the lower one is an image of a paddler performing the hongi with his canoe at Waitangi, which is in the far north of New Zealand. And so those two images are just there to kind of, as context for this last bit I'm going to talk about. So the hongi is an intimate act of greeting between people, living or dead. In my part of the world, we hongi the dead. They don't in other parts of the country. Or between people and objects, such as this canoe, or the tree from which it was carved. The nose and the forehead are pressed firmly together to allow an intermingling of mauri and the exchange of home, which is a kind of energetic force too, often thought of as breath. So a kind of a literal matter energy flow and exchange. A hongi is an enactment of relations, of kinship, a material unfolding, opening possibilities for productive interaction. As one of my relatives lamented about Māori and Pākehā relations in New Zealand, which have their history in colonial relations, quote, "We do not sit comfortably together," or he said actually, "Your wairua and mine, or your spirit and mine, do not sit comfortably together. We have merely acknowledged each other's presence. Even after 150 years, we still choose merely to coexist. Come, feel the warmth of my nose." So this is actually 200 years, but he said this in 1990. Not much has changed. The hongi puts us face to face with humans and non-humans, actively opening us to material entanglements with real consequences for alliances. For Māori, face-to-face relations are the basis of human, non-human sociality. Facing others acknowledges our co-constitution and opens me to the responsibility incarnate in relations.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Right, kia ora te Kawehau. I'm going to extend some of these ideas into a somewhat different context, reading archival objects from the early 19th century in New Zealand, which is my project at the moment. Now I have to ask you to bracket the idea of the image and its production and framing on this PowerPoint here at this moment in Manchester in 2013, and to focus, if you can, on the material object represented here. It's an image of a fragment of text, a shape traced in ink on a fragile slice of vegetable-based paper. Even without Bennett's reminder, I'm continually struck by the vibrant presence these marks on paper have. Its mauri strikes me with physical force as I encounter it. If I were an archaeologist or an organic scientist or a material historian, I'd go into the detail of the nature, origin and manufacture of this assemblage of organic items, paper, ink, quill, that combined here 200 years ago to form this particular object. As an artist, I could perhaps extol the aesthetic character of the shape of the marks. As an expert in Ngāpuhi history, which is Te Kawehau's tribal group, I'm not an expert, if I were an expert in Ngāpuhi history, I could interrogate this cultural shape for its traditional meanings. A historian might be more interested in the context of the mark, the nature of the site on which it appears, and the events that created it. In straightforward material terms, the technological tools needed for the creation of this object would have been transported from England to New Zealand via Australia in the early 19th century. The sheer potentiality of this cargo is mind-boggling. Land deeds, death warrants, contracts, business deals, stories, war commands would be created and mobilised via the careful collisions of these precious piles of paper, the weighty glass bottles of ink, and the light boxes of quills brought together to shape human lives and deaths. As someone who seeks to study the establishment of the earliest educational relationships between Māori and Pākehā, I see such quill ink paper assemblages as key actors in Māori-Pākehā engagement. And I have to acknowledge my co-author, Cooney Jenkins, who's not here, for some of the debates that generated these ideas for me. This here that you see here is a moko, as I have written. I shouldn't really have given away. It's a representation of a facial tattoo. The moko is on the face of Hongihika, and he drew it in 1819, here on the second European land sale deed. 13,000 acres in return for 48 axes. Just to give you a sense of the value of the axes, in the small and first European settlement, the blacksmith had made 67 axes in that week. The parchment paper with its written details, you can see the moko there, its context. The parchment paper with its written details was prepared in Australia in advance. Then in New Zealand, the dimensions of the agreed land area would have been filled in on the spot, and those are there. The paper was laid on a flat surface. Nearby was placed a bottle of ink and a quill pen. Hongihika was the chief who, with his people, held mana whenua, or the authority of the land. He was familiar with the quill-like implements that he would have used, the quill that he would have made his mark with, because he would have been familiar with the tuhi making, which is the marking of the face prior to the carving into the face of the tattoo. And he would have been shown where to make his mark. He would not have been able to read this document. He had noted the European signature as the imprint of authority, and because his chiefly authority was written on his face, he invented the idea of the moko on paper as a mark equivalent to the Pākehā signature. Then, rather than only shaking hands with his European purchasers, he would have pressed his face to theirs in a hongi. This land deed is widely understood as evidence of Hongihika's selling of 13,000 acres to Pākehā. The land on which the town of Kerikeri now stands is permanently in the ownership of individual Pākehā. The Māori people who once lived here now inhabit the poor outskirts of the town and the rural surrounding area. And just to put this in context, this was the second land deed that was ever made in New Zealand. The first one also has similar signatures. It's got its own story, but that item has disappeared from the archives, so we're waiting for it one day to reappear, unfortunately. Now, return to the moko. Look at it. Follow Bennett's methodology. She says, give patient sensory attentiveness to its materiality and its forces. Feel the presence and authority of a renowned warrior chief. This moko, his own face with its lines of huge significance, beauty and individual identity, becomes a face against which we might press our own in a hongi, feeling its ridges carved into the surface of the skin and mingling our breath with his. Its invitation, as Te Kawehau's relative said, feel the warmth of my nose, does not push us and the Kerikeri land away, alienated forever. It pulls us into a relationship with the flows of power represented here. And just for those of you not familiar with a moko, this is the forehead, the eyes would have been here. This is on the side of the nose, so here is the nose, and the mouth is here, and these lines would have been round the side of his mouth. The time required for Hongi to execute the detail of his